Imagine being on the verge of one of the biggest victories of your career, about to dismantle a powerful corruption network that has evaded justice for years. Julia Harris, a determined and ambitious prosecutor, finds herself in this position as she confronts a powerful senator accused of diverting millions of dollars. However, as she delves deeper into the investigation, she begins to realize that the seemingly irrefutable evidence may have been planted. Someone, or something, has been manipulating the case from the start, and the lies are spreading faster than she can control. If you've ever questioned whom you can really trust or felt insecure about the truth in front of you, this story will draw you in. Julia believed she was in control, but as revelations emerge, the plot thickens, and danger lurks where she least expects. Julia Harris adjusted her glasses as she stared at the stack of documents in front of her. The case seemed perfect. Detailed evidence, compromising recordings, and witnesses directly linking Senator Victor Owens to a multi-million-dollar corruption scheme. For a young, ambitious, and recently promoted prosecutor, this case could be the key to skyrocketing her career. But something about it bothered her. In the background, her mentor, veteran prosecutor Frank Mitchell, watched her with concern. He knew that feeling well, when things seemed too good to be true. Julia, on the other hand, was convinced she finally had the opportunity to dismantle a corrupt scheme that had been eluding justice for years. Victor Owens was a powerful figure, and bringing him to justice would be a triumph. She couldn't ignore the chance. "Frank, I'm going after this man with everything I've got," Julia said, determined. Frank sighed. "Just be careful. Owens isn't just anyone. In this case, something doesn't feel right. Have you seen this before?" Julia averted her gaze. She knew Frank was trying to protect her, but the possibility of victory was too tempting. In the files was everything she would need to convict the senator: emails compromising his actions, financial transactions revealing bribes, and clandestine recordings of suspicious meetings. She had spent months piecing together the puzzle, and everything pointed directly to Owens. That night, Julia took the files home. She wanted to study every detail before the preliminary hearing. The evidence seemed solid, but the more she reviewed it, the more a sense of unease grew in her chest. There were strange patterns in the documents, dates too close together, testimonies too identical, and a calculated precision that didn't match the complexity of such a large scheme. The next morning, in court, Senator Owens appeared with his lawyer, Martin Blake, a heavyweight in the legal world. During the initial testimonies, something unexpected happened. Blake presented evidence Julia had never seen before, a document claiming that part of the recordings against Owens had been tampered with. The courtroom fell silent as Julia tried to comprehend what was happening. How was that possible? After the hearing, Julia rushed to find Frank. "This doesn't make sense, Frank. I reviewed all the recordings, all the files. How does he have something I've never seen?" Frank looked at her gravely. "That's what I was trying to tell you. There's something wrong with this case." Julia began to question everything. What if the evidence against Owens had been planted? Who would do that, and why? The senator had enemies, that much was certain. But how far would they go to incriminate him? She needed to uncover the truth before it was too late. Julia frantically skimmed through the documents in the silence of her office. Blake's revelation had shaken her, but at the same time, it ignited a new spark of distrust. Who would have an interest in manipulating the evidence against Senator Owens? And why was she, a still-rising prosecutor, being led directly into a trap? The unease only grew. She needed to investigate on her own, outside the office's spotlight. She decided to start with one of the key witnesses in the case, a man named Robert Ward, a former aide to Owens who had provided valuable information for the accusations. Julia had interrogated him several times, and he seemed solid, confident. But now, with doubt hanging over everything, she felt Ward might know more than he had revealed. Finding him was easy. He often frequented a discreet bar in Georgetown. Julia arrived and spotted him in the corner, having a drink, seemingly at ease. She approached and sat next to him. "Ward, I need to talk," Julia said, her voice firm but laced with tension she tried to hide. He smiled almost amiably, but something in his eyes made her uneasy. "Prosecutor Harris, what brings you here so late?" "We need to talk about the evidence you gave me. Something doesn't add up, and now things are starting to spiral out of control. The recordings, they may have been tampered with." Ward kept the smile, but his posture stiffened slightly. "Tampered with? I don't know what you're talking about. I've been clear with you from the beginning, gave you everything I had." Julia stared at him firmly. "Are you sure what you gave me is real? Or are you being manipulated too?" For a brief moment, something in Ward's face changed. Hesitation. He glanced around, as if looking for an exit. "Look, I did what they asked. I don't know what else you want from me," he said, his voice lower, almost a whisper. "Who asked you?" Ward, you need to be honest with me now. We're dealing with something much bigger than we thought. Ward seemed panicked. He abruptly stood up, throwing some bills on the table. Sorry, Julia, but I think this conversation is over. And he left without looking back. Julia stood there, watching as he disappeared through the door. Something was definitely very wrong. Robert Ward knew more than he was letting on, and it was now clear he feared something, or someone. When she returned home that night, she found an unmarked envelope under the door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message that made her heart race, be careful whom you trust. The warning was clear. Julia felt the weight of the conspiracy closing in around her. And the question echoing in her mind now was, who else, besides Ward, was involved? The cold wind of the early morning cut across Julia's face as she drove through the empty streets of Washington. The anonymous note lingered in her mind. Who had sent it? Was it an attempt to intimidate her, or was someone really trying to help? The questions hammered in her head as she made her way to the only place she could find some answers that night, Frank Mitchell's office. When she arrived at the building, the hallway was dark and silent, with only the dim light from a desk lamp illuminating Frank's room. Julia entered without knocking. He was there, focused on some files, but he immediately looked up when he saw the grave expression on Julia's face. "We need to talk," she said, without preamble. Frank closed the folder in front of him and crossed his arms. "I figured. Something happen?" Julia tossed the note onto his desk. "This was waiting for me when I got home." Frank picked up the paper, read it quickly, and frowned. "This is starting to smell really bad, Julia. You have to be careful. If this is a threat, it means someone's already watching you closely." Julia huffed nervously. "I know, Frank. But what I don't understand is why they'd be so determined to stop this investigation. If Senator Owens is guilty, why not let him fall? And if he's innocent, who the hell is orchestrating all of this?" Frank remained silent for a few moments, deep in thought. "Maybe it's not about him, Julia. It could be something bigger, a power play we don't fully understand yet." She knew Frank was right, but even so, everything still felt too uncertain. She decided to change the subject. "I talked to Robert Ward. He's hiding something. When I pressed him, he bolted like a coward." Frank stood up and walked to the window. "Ward has always been a weak link in this game. He might be in someone bigger's pocket, someone who's pulling all the strings. Someone who doesn't want us to get to the bottom of this." Julia stood up, her mind racing. What if Ward is just a pawn? What if there's someone, maybe inside the system, planting this evidence to set me up? Frank turned around, his eyes serious. "If you're right, that means we're dealing with a conspiracy much deeper than we could have imagined. And the only way out of this is to figure out who's in control before they silence you." Julia's phone rang, cutting through the tension in the air. She glanced at the screen. The number was unknown. She answered cautiously. "Prosecutor Harris?" The voice on the other end was deep and low. "Who is this?" Julia asked, her hand beginning to tremble. "If you want to survive, stop looking. There are forces involved that you don't understand. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." Julia's heart raced. Before she could respond, the line went dead. She stared at the phone for a few seconds, the weight of the situation finally starting to hit her fully. Frank approached her, concern etched on his face. "Julia, what happened?" She raised her eyes slowly. "I've just been threatened, again." Frank took a deep breath. "We're on the right track, but the question now is, are we willing to pay the price?" Julia knew the price would be steep. And more than ever, she was certain that her biggest challenge wasn't Senator Owens, but the invisible enemies orchestrating every move from behind the scenes. The sense of false victory hung in the air. In the days following the anonymous threat, Julia decided to move forward with the charges against Senator Owens. She knew she was dealing with something much larger, but there was no turning back. Either she pushed ahead, or they would destroy her anyway. Every step she took seemed choreographed by invisible forces, but even so, the prosecutor believed she had managed to make progress. The case finally reached the preliminary hearing. The courtroom was packed. Senator Owens, impeccably dressed, entered accompanied by Martin Blake, his ruthless attorney. On Julia's side, the evidence still seemed solid, and she was preparing to face the defense's full force. As the session began, the tension was palpable. Julia presented the initial testimonies and the recordings as evidence, and for a brief moment, it seemed Owens was cornered. The judge appeared inclined to accept the evidence as admissible, and Julia felt a fleeting sense of victory. She knew there was still a long way to go, but everything indicated that the prosecution was in control. Blake, however, remained unbothered. He sat there, unflinching, with a faint smile on his lips, as if he knew something Julia didn't. And when his turn came to speak, everything changed. Where does the prosecution think they're going with these fabricated accusations? Blake said, his voice echoing through the courtroom. Julia leaned forward, ready to counter. But what came next made her blood run cold. Blake raised a new set of documents that had yet to be presented in the case. I would like to introduce to the court new evidence that completely dismantles the prosecution's accusations. These documents prove that the recordings were tampered with, the testimonies manipulated, and that this entire case is nothing more than a conspiracy against Senator Owens. The courtroom immediately buzzed with murmurs. Julia felt a wave of panic rise up her spine. How did he have that? Those documents had never been presented, and she had no idea where they had come from. Blake continued, "These documents, Your Honor, clearly show that someone, perhaps from within the justice system itself, orchestrated an attack on Victor Owens, fabricating evidence and manipulating witnesses." The judge looked at Julia, waiting for her response. She could barely breathe. It felt like the ground was opening up beneath her feet. Everything she had gathered, all the evidence she thought was secure, was now under attack. "These allegations are absurd," Julia said, her voice faltering slightly. "That evidence cannot be real. The senator is clearly involved in a corruption scheme." But the damage was already done. Blake had planted the seed of doubt. And worse, he had shifted the blame onto the system, suggesting that someone from within was framing Owens, and, by extension, Julia herself. After the session, Julia felt the weight of impending defeat. She knew this wasn't a coincidence. Someone had been manipulating the evidence from the start, but she still didn't know who. After the court session, Julia walked out, feeling as though the ground had been pulled from under her. The once solid case against Senator Owens was crumbling, and she had no idea who was behind it. As she stood outside the courthouse, trying to gather her thoughts, Frank approached her with a serious look on his face. "I warned you," Frank said, his voice low as he guided her away from the curious onlookers and media swarming the courthouse doors. "This victory was an illusion, Julia." Blake was ready for this. He had the right cards all along. Julia stepped back, frustrated. "How did he get those documents, Frank?" "I reviewed everything. Nothing was wrong until now." "Who is doing this?" Frank hesitated for a moment, then looked at her directly. "It might be closer than you think. Julia, we need to consider the possibility that someone inside your own team is working against you." Julia shook her head in disbelief. "You think someone in the prosecution is sabotaging the case?" "It's possible. And until you figure out who it is, you're playing their game, dancing to their tune. And trust me, they're very good at it." Julia felt the weight of his words. Someone from the inside. A traitor. She had been manipulated from the beginning, and now, the person working against her was hiding in plain sight. That night, Julia sat in her dimly lit apartment, poring over the case documents again. The glow from her laptop was the only light in the room, and the sound of her typing echoed through the silence. Frank's warning kept replaying in her head. Someone inside the prosecution was playing both sides, but who? She scrolled through the internal communications from the case, looking for anything that stood out. Then she saw it, a short, discreet email from one of her assistants, Mark Evans, to someone outside the prosecution office. The message was cryptic, almost insignificant, but one line caught her eye, *, everything is set for the hearing. They won't see it coming. *. Julia's blood ran cold. Mark had been one of the closest assistants on the case, someone she trusted implicitly. Now it was clear, he had been involved in something much darker. He was sabotaging the case from the inside, helping to manipulate the evidence and create this web of lies. Without wasting any time, Julia grabbed her phone and called Frank. "I found it," she said as soon as he picked up. "Mark Evans. He's involved. I found an email linking him to someone outside the prosecution." Frank was silent for a moment. "I always had a feeling about him. He joined your team right when things started getting complicated. But are you sure?" "I'm sure. And that means he's been the bridge between the conspiracy and Senator Owens from the start. We need to move fast before he covers his tracks." Frank's voice was grave. "Julia, if this is true, we're dealing with something much bigger than we thought. If you confront Mark now, he could disappear with everything we have. We need to be strategic." Julia knew Frank was right, but the rage burning inside her was hard to contain. She wanted to confront Mark, to expose his betrayal. But doing that could put everything at risk. "Okay. We'll be careful," she agreed reluctantly. "But I'm going to keep him close. We can't let him slip away." In the days that followed, Julia kept Mark within arm's reach, pretending that everything was normal while secretly tracking his every move. She was sure he'd catch on at some point, but for now, Mark seemed completely unaware of her growing suspicion. Then came the bigger betrayal. One afternoon, Julia received an urgent call. It was Frank. "You need to come to my office. Now. When she arrived, the look on Frank's face made her stomach drop. He handed her a folder, saying nothing. Julia opened it and froze. Inside were bank transfers linking not just Mark, but also Frank. The account was offshore, buried under layers of shell companies, but the amounts were clear. Frank was involved. This can't be real, Julia stammered, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. Frank, what is this? He took a deep breath, avoiding her gaze. I wanted to tell you, Julia. I've wanted out for a long time. But when I got into this game, there was no way out. Julia stepped back, her heart pounding. You were behind this the whole time? Frank looked at her with deep sadness. It's not me, Julia. I'm just a pawn, just like you. They've had me in their grip for years. And if you keep digging, they'll destroy you too. Julia stumbled back, the weight of his words sinking in. The person she trusted most, her mentor, had been part of the conspiracy all along. He had known from the beginning, and now, at the critical moment, he was revealing himself as the traitor. You used me, she whispered, her voice barely audible. From the start. Frank sighed again, but this time, his expression hardened. Julia, I'm giving you a chance to walk away. Stop now, before it's too late. But Julia knew she was already in too deep to back down. The fight was just beginning, and now, she had more enemies than she had ever imagined. She was alone. Julia left Frank's office with trembling hands, her stomach churning. The realization that her mentor, the man she had trusted implicitly, had been part of the conspiracy shook her to her core. As she walked aimlessly through the streets of Washington, trying to process everything, a burning question gnawed at her. How had she missed the signs? And now that she knew Frank was just a pawn, who was really pulling the strings? Her steps took her to the prosecutor's office. It was late, and the building was nearly empty. Julia entered quietly and went straight to her desk. She needed a plan. Something that could turn the tide. The evidence she had against Senator Owens was still valid, but now it was tainted. She needed something more solid, something that could expose everyone involved, including Frank and Mark. But before she could put any plan into action, a new thought struck her. If Frank had been involved from the start, he also knew the deepest secrets of this network. And somehow, there might be a chance he had left clues, however small. Julia realized she had no other choice, she had to search Frank's office. Carefully, she slipped into Frank's office. It was dark and eerily quiet. She sat in the chair she had occupied so many times during casual conversations with her mentor, but now, everything felt cold, distant. The desk was too neatly organized, as if Frank had been ready to disappear at a moment's notice. That's when Julia noticed, his laptop was still there, powered on, and in his rush to talk to her, Frank had left his session open. Her hands shook as she navigated through his emails. One folder stood out, private. Julia hesitated for a moment, but she knew she had no choice. Inside the folder, she found something that nearly made her fall out of the chair, a series of emails between Frank and Mark Evans, detailing the sabotage of the entire case, from manipulating evidence to the steps they would take to discredit her in court. But that wasn't all. There was another name in the emails, a name that Julia never would have expected, Senator Victor Owens himself. Julia felt the ground drop from beneath her. Owens, the man she had been trying to bring down, was the mastermind behind the entire conspiracy. And Frank had been helping him cover it all up. But then, something even more devastating appeared on the screen, a recent transfer to an offshore account, in Julia's name. She gasped for air. Someone was trying to frame her, to make her look like the real traitor in the system. With this, her career would be ruined, and Owens would walk away unscathed. It was the perfect setup. Julia's phone rang, breaking the silence. She answered with trembling hands. The voice on the other end was familiar, but now it carried a dark tone. Julia, stop what you're doing right now. They already know you're digging. It was Frank. He had been watching her. Maybe the whole time. Why are you doing this, Frank? Tell me the truth. Julia shouted, barely containing her desperation. I have no choice, Julia. I told you, they're in control. And now there's no way out for either of us. Before Julia could respond, Frank hung up, leaving her alone with her discoveries. The reality of the situation weighed heavily on her. Everything had been a setup. Owens had orchestrated every move. But worst of all, her own reputation was about to be destroyed. Julia knew she had to act fast. If they already knew she was close to the truth, time was running out. She made copies of all the evidence she found on Frank's laptop and left the office, with only one thought in her mind: expose everything before they silenced her. That night, as she drove aimlessly through the city, the weight of the revelations pressed down on her. There was no one left to trust. Her allies had become her worst enemies, and the web of corruption was far deeper than she had ever imagined. But one thing was certain, she wasn't going to stop until she brought down everyone involved, no matter the cost. Julia parked her car in a dark alley, far from any prying eyes. The city was asleep, but she knew her enemies were more awake than ever. At any moment, they could realize what she had uncovered. With the copies of Frank's emails in hand and proof of her being framed, Julia had one final shot, perhaps her last, to turn the tables. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years, one that might just be her lifeline. Sarah Duvall, an old college friend who was now an investigative journalist, known for taking down powerful figures. Julia had always admired Sarah's fearless pursuit of truth, and now she needed her help more than ever. "Sarah, it's me. I've got something huge, but I need your help," Julia said, her voice tight with urgency. On the other end, Sarah hesitated for a second. "Julia? What's going on?" "It's about Senator Owens. There's a much bigger conspiracy at play, and I'm caught in the middle of it. They're trying to frame me, Sarah. I've got the proof, but I need to go public before they take me down." There was a brief silence before Sarah spoke again, this time with more resolve. "Meet me in half an hour. But be careful, Julia. If this is as serious as it sounds, they're already following you." Julia ended the call, her heart pounding. Sarah was right. She was sure she was being watched. Every move now had to be calculated. She double-checked her surroundings before driving off to the meeting place. The cafe where Sarah waited was almost deserted, the dim lighting casting long shadows that made the whole situation feel even more clandestine. Julia arrived and spotted Sarah in the back corner, hunched over her notepad. She looked up as Julia entered, her face a mix of concern and focus. "Tell me everything," Sarah said, leaning in as soon as Julia sat down. "But keep it quick." Julia pulled out the documents and explained the sabotage, the manipulated evidence, and the betrayal by Frank. As she laid out the details, Sarah's pen moved furiously across her notepad. With every word, the gravity of the situation deepened. "This is explosive," Sarah muttered, her eyes scanning the emails. "If we can get this out before they act, we can not only save your career but destroy theirs." Julia nodded, but a gnawing feeling of unease wouldn't leave her. "There's something else, Sarah." Frank said something before he hung up. He talked about them being in control, but he never specified who. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You think there's someone bigger pulling the strings?" Julia stared out the window, trying to connect the pieces. "Owens is powerful, but I don't think he's the one orchestrating this. There has to be someone above him, someone with more reach." Suddenly, a name flashed in Julia's mind, Howard Kingsley. The name carried a weight that made her breath hitch. Kingsley, a media mogul and longtime ally of Owens, was known for his influence in both political and corporate circles. His media empire had shaped public opinion for decades, and his companies had lucrative contracts with Owens' office. Julia realized it made perfect sense. "It's Kingsley," she whispered, almost not believing it herself. "He's behind all of this. Owens is just a piece in the puzzle. Kingsley is the real architect." Sarah stared at her, stunned. "If Kingsley's involved, this goes way beyond anything we've imagined. He has the resources and connections to destroy you, Julia. Maybe even worse." Julia's pulse quickened. She was standing at the edge of an abyss. Kingsley had the power to crush her publicly, financially, and physically. This wasn't just about taking down Owens anymore, this was about survival. "We need to act now," Julia said, her voice firm. "You need to publish this, Sarah. It's my only chance to survive." Sarah snapped her notepad shut and rose to her feet. "I'll get to work on this immediately. But you need to lay low, Julia. Don't let them find you." As Sarah hurried out of the cafe, Julia felt the adrenaline flood her veins. She was about to expose the most powerful men in Washington. But she also knew that the price of exposing them could be her life. 2 days later, the story hit the headlines like a bombshell. The front page read, "Corruption Scandal, Senator Owens and Howard Kingsley exposed in monumental conspiracy." Julia watched the fallout from a safe house, hidden from the public eye. Owens was arrested, Kingsley had disappeared, and the FBI had opened a massive investigation into both men. The media was in a frenzy, and it seemed like Julia had won. The truth had been revealed. But the victory felt hollow. Julia knew that exposing these men wasn't the end. The conspiracy ran deeper than she had imagined. Even though Owens and Kingsley were out of the picture, there were still others pulling the strings from the shadows. And they would come for her. Julia stared at her phone, remembering Frank's last words before he vanished, "They never stop, Julia." And she knew that was true. Though justice had been served, the system's corruption had been laid bare. But the enemies who lurked in the dark were still out there, and they wouldn't rest until they got what they wanted. As she thought about everything that had happened, Julia asked herself the same question she had been asking all along. What would you do? Would you risk everything, your career, your safety, to expose a truth no one wants to see? How far would you go to bring down powerful enemies when there's no one left to trust? Julia had made her choice. She faced dilemmas few would be prepared to handle, and in the end, she stood against forces much larger than herself. But was it worth it? She had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The cost of truth was high, and Julia knew she would spend the rest of her life paying it. And you, what would you have done in Julia's place? Would you have risked it all for the truth? Days had passed since the story had blown open, and Julia remained in hiding, her life a whirlwind of uncertainty. The exposure of Senator Owens and Howard Kingsley had sent shockwaves through Washington, but Julia knew better than to celebrate. She was a marked woman now, and the enemies she had made were powerful, with resources that reached far beyond what was visible. Her phone buzzed, and she hesitated before answering, half expecting it to be another threat. It wasn't. Sarah's name flashed on the screen. "Julia," Sarah said, her voice filled with urgency, "we've got a problem. Kingsley's disappearance isn't what it seems." Julia's grip tightened on the phone. "What do you mean? He's been hiding, hasn't he?" "That's what we thought," Sarah said, her voice lowering. "But I've been digging deeper. Kingsley didn't disappear, he's been protected. There's a network of powerful individuals behind this, even bigger than we imagined. They're helping him avoid any fallout. We've only scratched the surface." Julia felt a familiar chill creep up her spine. She had thought that by exposing Owens and Kingsley, she had torn down the web of corruption. But now, it seemed that was only the beginning. "How do you know this?" Julia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been following some leads," Sarah explained. "I found out that several high-ranking officials, both in government and business, have been quietly pulling strings to keep Kingsley out of sight and out of reach. They've gone to great lengths to protect him, Julia. We're dealing with a network of people more powerful than we anticipated." Julia sank into a chair, her mind racing. If Kingsley was being protected by others, people who had even more influence than she could imagine, it meant that the fight wasn't over. Far from it. In fact, it was just beginning. "They're not going to stop until I'm silenced," Julia said, more to herself than to Sarah. "That's what I'm worried about," Sarah replied. "You need to be careful. If they protected Kingsley, they won't hesitate to come after you. You've already disrupted too much." Julia stood up and began pacing the small room. Her fight had already cost her everything, her sense of security, her trust in the system, and the relationships she had built along the way. Now, she was left with a choice: go underground and protect herself, or double down and expose the rest of the corruption, no matter the cost. "Sarah," Julia said, stopping in her tracks, "I'm not going to run." Sarah was silent on the other end of the line. "You're sure? This isn't just Kingsley anymore. These people have reach, Julia. If you go any further, they might come for you in ways you can't prepare for." Julia clenched her fists. "I've come too far to back down now. I need to expose them all. Every last one of them." "You'll need more than just me to take them down," Sarah said, her voice tense. "This is going to require a lot more firepower than a few journalists. We need to build a coalition of people who are willing to fight this battle." Julia knew Sarah was right. This fight was beyond her now, but she couldn't do it alone. The system itself was infected, and the corruption reached into the highest levels of power. She would need to find allies who were just as willing to risk it all. "Who can we trust?" Julia asked, already thinking about potential names, people she had crossed paths with over the years, those who had shown integrity in a system riddled with deceit. "I have some ideas," Sarah replied. "But we need to be careful. If even one of them is compromised, it could lead straight back to you." Julia nodded, though Sarah couldn't see her. "We'll start small. Bring in only the people we absolutely trust. And from there, we'll build the case, piece by piece." It was a daunting task, but Julia had made up her mind. If Kingsley was protected, that meant there were more powerful figures involved than she had originally thought. She had thought she was exposing one conspiracy, but in reality, she had uncovered the tip of the iceberg. "We'll need to gather more evidence," Sarah continued. "More than what we have on Kingsley. If we're going to bring down these people, we'll need irrefutable proof." Julia thought back to Frank, to the emails she had found. The betrayal still stung, but she knew Frank had been just another pawn in this larger game. Whoever was really in control had pulled him in long before Julia had even become aware of the situation. "Frank might have more information," Julia said after a moment. "He's been in this longer than I have. If there's a bigger conspiracy, he's bound to know more than what I found on his laptop." "You think he'll talk?" Sarah asked skeptically. "From what you've told me, he's still loyal to whoever is pulling the strings." Julia bit her lip. He's trapped, like I was. But if I can get to him before they silence him, I might be able to convince him to help us. He knows more than he's let on. I'm sure of it. There was a long pause on the line before Sarah finally spoke. It's risky, but if you think it's worth a shot, I'll back you up. Just be careful, Julia. If they catch wind of what you're doing, this time they won't just send threats. I know, Julia replied. But I'm not going to let them win. After hanging up, Julia stared out of the window, her reflection blurred in the dark glass. She was about to go even deeper into a dangerous game, one where the stakes were higher than ever. But the decision was made. She was in this fight until the very end. With one final look at the city below, Julia picked up her bag, grabbed the files, and prepared herself for the next step. She had taken down powerful enemies before, but now, she was facing something far more insidious. The real power players were still out there, and they wouldn't rest until she was silenced. But neither would she. Julia had taken down Owens, exposed Kingsley, and uncovered the tip of a vast network of corruption. But what would you do in her place? Would you keep fighting, knowing the risk it posed to your life? Or would you walk away, hoping someone else would pick up the torch? Julia had made her decision, and now the fight was just beginning. Julia knew she was stepping into a war zone. The next move could make or break everything she had fought for. But there was no turning back now. Too many lives were at stake, including her own. She had spent the last few days carefully planning her approach, keeping her movements discreet. If Kingsley's network was as far-reaching as she suspected, any misstep could end with her being silenced for good. The next morning, Julia made her way to the last place she ever thought she'd return to, Frank's office. She had arranged the meeting through a back channel, knowing that contacting him directly could be intercepted. He had agreed to meet her, though his message was cryptic and brief. She wasn't sure what to expect. As she stepped into the old government building, memories of their conversations and mentorship played in her mind. She had trusted Frank completely once, but now, that trust was shattered. Still, he held the key to uncovering the bigger players. She just needed to get him to talk before it was too late. The office was empty when she arrived. The lights were dim, casting long shadows across the worn leather furniture. Frank had always preferred working in the quiet, away from the hustle of the courthouse. She took a deep breath, bracing herself for the confrontation. Moments later, Frank entered the room, looking older, wearier than the last time she saw him. He didn't offer a smile or any greeting, just a tired nod. He knew why she was here. "You shouldn't have come," Frank said quietly, closing the door behind him. "I had no choice," Julia responded, her voice steady despite the tension. "I need answers, Frank. The full story." Frank sighed and walked over to his desk, sitting down heavily. "Julia, you're playing with fire. You don't understand how deep this goes." "I understand enough," Julia said firmly. "Kingsley didn't disappear. He's being protected by people who are even more powerful than him. You've been in this game for years, Frank. You know who they are." Frank rubbed his temples, the weight of years of secrets pressing down on him. "You think this is just about Kingsley and Owens? They're just pieces, Julia. There are people, powerful people, who have been running this operation for decades. Kingsley is just a face for the public. The real players, they don't like being exposed. And they'll do anything to protect their empire." "I need names," Julia demanded, her eyes locked on him. "I need to know who's pulling the strings." Frank shook his head. "If I tell you, they'll come after you harder than they already are. You've seen what they're capable of. The threats, the setups. It's only a matter of time before they make a real move against you." "They're already coming for me," Julia shot back. "But I'm not going to stop, Frank. Not until I take them all down. So, if you want to help me, now's your chance." There was a long silence. Frank stared at the floor, conflicted, knowing that once he gave her the information, there was no going back for either of them. Finally, he looked up, his face etched with resignation. "There's one man at the top," he said slowly. "One person who controls the entire operation from the shadows. He's the one Kingsley and Owens have been working for." Julia leaned in, her heart pounding. "Who?" Frank hesitated, then spoke a name that sent a chill down Julia's spine. "Harrison Cole." Julia froze. Harrison Cole was a name she knew well. He was a billionaire industrialist, someone whose influence spanned across multiple sectors: energy, media, finance. He had built an empire over decades, carefully cultivating a public image of a philanthropist and self-made man. But there had always been rumors about the darker side of his empire, whispers of backroom deals and shadowy connections to political powerhouses. "Harrison Cole?" Julia repeated, barely able to process the enormity of the revelation. "He's behind all of this?" Frank nodded gravely. "Cole has been financing and orchestrating the entire network. Every corrupt politician, every rigged contract, every bribe, it all goes back to him. Kingsley and Owens were just doing his bidding, using their influence to move things along. But Cole is untouchable. He has enough money, power, and connections to make problems disappear. People who go after him don't survive for long. Julia clenched her fists, feeling the full weight of what she was up against. Harrison Cole wasn't just another corrupt businessman. He was the kingpin, the man behind the curtain who could destroy anyone who got in his way. "Why did you get involved, Frank?" Julia asked softly, her voice betraying the hurt she still felt. "You could have walked away. You could have warned me." Frank's eyes darkened with regret. "I tried to, Julia. But once you're in, you can't get out. They had me years ago, the minute I took that first bribe, the minute I turned a blind eye. And I've been trapped ever since." Julia looked at him, her emotions conflicted. Part of her wanted to feel sympathy for Frank. After all, he had been her mentor, the person who had guided her career. But the other part of her felt nothing but betrayal. He had known about the corruption for years and had done nothing. "I'm going to stop him," Julia said, her voice cold with resolve. "No matter what it takes." Frank shook his head slowly. "You don't understand, Julia. Cole is playing a game that you can't win. He's protected by people you haven't even begun to see. If you go after him, it won't just be your career at risk. It'll be your life." Julia stood up, her decision made. "I've made it this far, Frank. I'm not turning back now." As she turned to leave, Frank called after her, his voice filled with a mix of desperation and warning. "Julia, don't do this. You won't make it. Cole will bury you before you even get close." But Julia didn't stop. She walked out of the office and into the cold Washington air, her mind focused on one thing: Harrison Cole. He was the man behind everything, the one who had orchestrated her downfall and the downfall of countless others. And now, she was going to bring him down, no matter what the cost. Back in her car, Julia felt the weight of the next step pressing down on her. Harrison Cole was more dangerous than anyone she had ever faced. He was powerful, untouchable, and ruthless. But she knew that exposing him was the only way to stop the conspiracy for good. Her phone buzzed again. It was Sarah. "What did you find out?" Sarah asked, her voice urgent. "Harrison Cole," Julia said, the name feeling heavy on her tongue. "He's the one behind everything." There was a long pause on the other end. "Cole?" Sarah finally replied, her tone filled with shock. "Julia, that's huge. But it's also dangerous. If he's behind this, you're in more danger than ever." "I know," Julia said quietly. "But I don't have a choice. We need to expose him." Sarah's voice was filled with tension. "Then we're going to need more than just what we have. We need solid proof, something that can't be buried or discredited. Something that will force even Cole's allies to turn on him." Julia took a deep breath. "I know where to start. But it's going to take everything we've got." As she hung up the phone, Julia steeled herself for the battle ahead. Harrison Cole was the most dangerous man in Washington, and bringing him down would require more than just determination. It would require outsmarting one of the most powerful networks in the world. But Julia wasn't afraid anymore. She had come too far to back down now. The only way forward was through the storm, and she was ready. The question remains, if you were in Julia's shoes, would you continue down this dangerous path, knowing the risks? Would you fight to expose a man like Harrison Cole, no matter the cost? Julia had made her choice. Now, the fight for justice was about to begin, and it would be the most dangerous one yet.